the largest land mammal found in North America. Wood bison were declared extinct in the 1900s until a tiny herd was found in a remote section of Canada.
28 animals. That's all they had. 28 bison in wooden crates on a military plane, descending toward a dirt airstrip in the middle of Canada's boreal wilderness. June 1980, a place so remote it barely registers on maps. Nobody cheered when the cargo doors opened. The scientists involved will tell you that themselves, because they knew the math. One brutal winter, one disease, one hungry wolf pack, and a bad calving season, and the whole experiment dies before it ever gets going. 28 is not a buffer against catastrophe. It is the catastrophe, narrowly avoided every single day. That's not what happened. What happened instead, what 45 years of data now reveals, is something researchers still struggle to explain. Not just that the animals survived, but what they did next, where they went, what they changed, how a landscape that had been quietly dying for 100 years began, almost immediately, to wake up. This is the story of the most improbable wildlife recovery in North American history. A species erased on purpose. A researcher who spotted something impossible from a plane window. And what happens when you return, the one animal a wilderness was built around, the animal nobody thinks about. Before you can understand what was lost, you need to understand what the wood bison actually is. Most people hear the word bison and picture the shaggy plains version, the one from old coins and Western films. The wood bison is its northern cousin, and the comparison doesn't do it justice. A mature bull weighs over 2,000 pounds, stands close to 6 feet at the shoulder. That hump of muscle above its front legs isn't decorative, it's an engine. The wood bison uses it to plow through snowdrifts deeper than its own legs, sweeping frozen ground aside to reach the forage beneath. In conditions that would starve almost any other large grazer on the continent, this animal thrives. It is, by every biological measure, designed for the north, for the cold, for exactly the kind of boreal wilderness that humans have historically written off as too harsh for anything to flourish in. It is, in a very real sense, what survival looks like when 10,000 years of northern winters have done their selecting. But mass isn't what makes the wood bison important. What makes it important is what it does to the land it walks on. It's not just a grazer, it's a builder. When a herd moves across a boreal meadow, it doesn't just eat, it crops the grass low, stimulating the root systems that hold soil together. It tramples dead, standing vegetation back down into the ground, cycling nutrients instead of letting them decay in the open air. It spreads nitrogen-rich dung across thousands of square kilometers, feeding soils that would otherwise lock their nutrients away for decades. And it carves wallows, shallow pits rolled into the earth by animals weighing a ton, that fill with rainwater and become tiny wetlands, holding water long enough for amphibians to breed in country that's otherwise too dry for them. Research into bison wallowing has found that these depressions do far more than hold water. They create entirely distinct microbial communities in the soil beneath them. Different bacteria, different fungi, different chemistry that would not exist without the animal's weight and repetitive behavior. Some wallows hold water for weeks after rainfall, functioning as ephemeral wetland systems that support aquatic invertebrates and provide breeding habitat for species that have no other option in dry season boreal terrain. Scientists tracking arthropod diversity have documented that abandoned wallows, ones the bison have moved on from, develop their own succession of plant and insect communities over years, distinct from both the active wallow and the surrounding prairie. The bison, in other words, doesn't just create one habitat. It creates a chain of them, each stage supporting a different community, each community handing off to the next as the years pass. Every female in a herd carries a kind of inherited map. The calving grounds, the mineral licks, the best meadows for a November storm. She learned those roots from her mother. Her mother learned them from hers. The ecological knowledge of a functioning boreal system is stored, in part, in the memory of the animals that shape it. Strip the animals out, and you don't just lose the behavior, you lose the accumulated geographic intelligence of generations. The landscape forgets where its own productive corridors are, because the creature that knew them is gone. Remove those animals, and you don't just lose a herd. You switch off a process. You erase a memory the land was using. Canada switched it off deliberately. How a continent erased them. Starting in the mid-1800s, as the commercial hide trade pushed north, the wood bison was reclassified in the plainest possible terms. Not an animal, a resource, something to be stripped from the land and converted into profit before the next outfit got there first. At its historical peak, the wood bison population is estimated to have numbered around 168,000 animals, spread across the boreal forests of northwestern North America, from central Alaska to the western edge of Saskatchewan. That's not a species occupying a landscape. That's a species defining one. The boreal north, as it existed before European contact, was shaped in part by the movement, grazing, and engineering of this single animal. Repeating rifles made the work horrifyingly fast. A single crew could move into a valley, locate a herd, and leave the ground empty within a single season. There was no recovery window. There was no regulatory floor. There was only the herd and the crew and the rifles, and then there was nothing. Not even the memory of the animals lingered in any official record, just silence, and grass growing back over ground that had been shaped for centuries by hooves and wallows. By the early 1900s, from a population of perhaps 168,000 animals, roughly 250 wood bison remained in all of North America. The calculation runs the other way, too. In less than 50 years, humanity had removed 99.85% of this animal from the continent, not over centuries, not gradually, within a human lifetime. Canada responded. In 1922, Wood Buffalo National Park was created specifically to protect the survivors. It was a genuine attempt at conservation, and it might have worked, except for the decision made in the years that followed. Between 6,000 and 7,000 plains bison, the other subspecies, were shipped into the same park from an overpopulated herd near Wainwright, Alberta. One expert at the time, Thomas Barber, director of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, called it one of the most tragic examples of bureaucratic stupidity in all of history. He was not wrong. The reasoning seemed sound. More bison in the park meant a larger, more viable herd. What it actually meant was interbreeding, disease transfer, and the irreversible blurring of a genetic line that had spent thousands of years adapting specifically to the boreal north. What had been preserved was being quietly, irreversibly dissolved. By the 1940s, biologists had reached a conclusion that closed the chapter entirely. The pure wood bison was gone. Extinct, not diminished, not critically endangered. Extinct. That conclusion sat in the scientific record for more than a decade. The thing the researchers saw from the window. In 1957, a Canadian Wildlife Service researcher named Dr. N.S. Nowakowski was flying a routine aerial survey over a remote section of Wood Buffalo National Park near the Nyarling River. What he spotted from that plane should not have been there. A herd, approximately 200 animals along a river corridor, isolated from the hybrid population by more than 100 kilometers of difficult terrain. No roads, no records of anyone having looked at this area carefully before. He studied them from the air. The humps were different, higher, more squared off. Not the shape of a hybrid, not what the hybrid line produced. Something older. Testing confirmed the impossible. These were genuine wood bison, disease-free, the closest thing to pure genetic stock left anywhere on Earth. A subspecies declared extinct had quietly survived in isolation, holding on in a corner of wilderness that no one had looked at carefully enough. They had been there the entire time, carrying the full biological inheritance of a species the scientific community had written off, invisible, simply because no one had flown that particular route with that particular quality of attention. One researcher, one flight pad, one bend of a river. That's how thin the margin was. In 1965, 22 of those animals were carefully captured and transported to Elk Island National Park in Alberta, fenced off from the park's existing plains bison herd, quarantined, managed with the explicit purpose of preserving every viable gene in the subspecies. Scientists called it a genetic ark, and that's exactly what it was. A holding vessel, or a biological inheritance the rest of the world had given up on. The herd grew slowly, carefully. Every generation was monitored. Every year was a calculation between population size and genetic health. Culling decisions were made with the kind of precision that kept the genetic diversity as wide as possible given the small numbers. And when the numbers finally reached the threshold where founders could be spared without jeopardizing the ark itself, Canada made its move. 28 wood bison were loaded onto a military transport aircraft. They flew north to the Nahanni Valley in the Northwest Territory, a site chosen for its boreal meadows, its mineral licks, the flat river country along the Liard that offered exactly what the species needed to feed, wallow, and survive a northern winter. In June of 1980, the cargo doors opened. 28 animals walked out into a valley they had never seen, and everyone who was part of that program held their breath, because with a founding group that small, the math was brutal. A single hard season could end it. What the land remembered. Within months, not years, months, the biologists monitoring the Nahanni herd documented something they hadn't expected to see so soon. The bison were already engineering. Meadows were being grazed down to the soil level. Wallows were being carved into the river flats and filling with rainwater. Willow thickets along the floodplain were being trampled back down. The full repertoire of ecosystem function that had been absent from this landscape for over a century switched back on almost the moment the animals arrived, as if the behavior had been preserved in the animal, waiting for the land to ask for it, as if the valley itself recognized what had returned. The ecological response was faster than the models predicted, and the population growth was faster than the projections allowed. Canada made 2 supplemental releases in the following years, 12 more animals near Nahanni Butte in 1989, and 59 animals released north of Fort Liard in 1998, not to rescue a struggling herd, but to widen its genetic base and ensure the recovery against the bottleneck that haunts any population founded on so few individuals. Total founding animals eventually reached 99. Every projection had to be revised upward. By the year 2000, the Nahanni population had passed 200 animals. In 2004 and 2011, aerial surveys counted roughly 400 animals. By 2017, the most comprehensive survey to that point counted approximately 960 bison moving across roughly 10,000 square kilometers, a range larger than Yellowstone National Park. The most recent estimate, from 2025, puts the Nahanni population at around 563 animals, a figure that reflects natural variation and the reality that even a recovered population moves through cycles of pressure and growth. Wolves, hard winters, anthrax. The threats that conservationists warned about from the beginning have never stopped being real. They just haven't been decisive. Canada's official wildlife authority has twice downgraded the wood bison's conservation status since the Nahanni program began, from endangered to threatened, and most recently to special concern. Each reclassification marked the first improvement the subspecies had seen since formal assessments began. Today, wood bison are found in 9 separate subpopulations across Canada, with additional herds established in Alaska and, remarkably, in the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, in northeastern Russia, where the wood bison's closest evolutionary relative, the steppe bison, went extinct roughly 6,000 years ago. The Elk Island herd has become, in the words of Parks Canada, a seed herd for the world, an institution that exports biological heritage the way other institutions export ideas. Most wood bison alive today are descended from those 22 animals captured near the Niarling River in 1965. Everything traces back to one researcher, one flight path, one river bend. What almost stopped it? It would be wrong to tell this story as though the recovery was inevitable. It wasn't. The threats that confronted the Nahanni herd from the very beginning were not hypothetical. They were documented, recurring, and in some cases very catastrophic. Anthrax, a bacterial disease caused by spores that can persist in soil for decades, surviving through freeze-thaw cycles and lying dormant until conditions bring them to the surface, has torn through northern bison populations in waves. The Mackenzie herd, one of the largest wood bison populations in Canada, declined by 53% following a single anthrax outbreak in 2012. A severe winter reduced the Haizama herd in Alberta by 20% through starvation alone. Road mortality along the highway corridor through the Nahanni Valley cost animals every year. Wolf predation thinned calves in deep snow winters, and the shadow that never fully lifted was disease, the bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis circulating in the hybrid herds of Wood Buffalo National Park, kept away from the clean Nahanni population only by distance and the vigilance of wildlife managers who understood exactly what contamination would mean. A single infected animal reaching the Nahanni herd could unravel decades of careful work in a single season. These weren't edge case scenarios. They were the baseline conditions under which the recovery happened. The reason the story ends the way it does isn't that the threats went away. It's that the founding population was resilient enough and the genetic base wide enough after the supplemental releases to absorb the losses without collapsing. Resilience wasn't an accident. It was engineered into the program through the careful management of the Elk Island Arc, through the decision to make 2 additional releases rather than trusting everything to the original 28. That's what 28 animals barely surviving couldn't have done. It's what 99 founders, carefully selected and disease-free, managed to do. The river they weren't supposed to cross. The numbers, as remarkable as they are, still aren't the headline. The headline is where the bison went. The original release was in the lower Liard Valley. The biologists had drawn their maps, noted the river boundaries, and assessed the range they expected the herd to occupy. The Liard River itself, petite, cold, powerful, was identified in the scientific literature as a natural barrier, a wall the bison would not cross. The bison crossed it, bank to bank, on their own initiative, without any human involvement. The herd swam the Liard River and established a permanent population in northeastern British Columbia. In habitat no human being had selected or prepared for them. The expansion didn't stop there. Wood bison from the Nahanni founder line have spread into the Yukon. They have moved into range that biologists, writing their original program documents, hadn't included in the optimistic projections, let alone the conservative ones. The federal government adapted. Rather than betting everything on a single population in a single location, Canada deliberately seeded founder herds across separate regions, parts of the Yukon, the lower Mackenzie Valley, the British Columbia border country, so that no single disease event, no single catastrophic winter could take the subspecies back to where it had been. The distribution of risk became the strategy. Wood bison from that single Nahanni founder line now hold territory across 3 separate Canadian jurisdictions. That is not the signature of a managed population. That is the signature of a species running itself. For over a century, this ecosystem had been drifting. Without a large grazer to keep them open, boreal meadows had slowly closed into forest. Old wallows had filled in. The slow redistribution of nutrients across the landscape had stopped. And over 100 years, those gradual shifts had compacted into a new normal, a valley that everyone alive simply assumed had always looked the way it did. The change was so slow it was invisible. The absence of the bison had become just the way things were. Now, that's reversing. Along the Liard corridor, meadows that had been quietly swallowed by trees are being held open again by an animal that performed this exact function for thousands of years before we removed it. Wallows are filling with water for the first time in living memory. Amphibians and insects that depend on those shallow, temporary pools are returning to ground they haven't occupied in generations. The compacted soil science documented as a consequence of the long absence, harder, drier, slower to absorb rainfall, is softening in zones where the bison have moved repeatedly through the same terrain. A 2022 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences tracked nearly 3 decades of data on bison reintroduction in a Kansas prairie. The results were stark. Returning bison roughly doubled the number of native plant species on the land, one of the largest grazing-driven biodiversity gains ever documented. That research involved plains bison on grassland, not wood bison in the boreal, so the comparison isn't direct. But it reveals something fundamental about this animal's relationship with the land. When you put the right species back into the system, it evolved to shape. The diversity that returns can be staggering. There's a separate line of science worth sitting with here. Research into bison wallowing has confirmed that these depressions don't just hold water, they increase what ecologists call beta diversity in the soil microbiome, the variety of microbial communities across a landscape, rather than just within any single point. A functioning bison range doesn't just have more species, it has more different kinds of ecological communities distributed across the terrain, each supporting things the others don't. The wallow isn't a hole in the ground. It's an address, a new neighborhood in an ecosystem that had been slowly homogenizing for a century. The full ecological accounting in the Nahanni system hasn't been completed, but 45 years of continuous data from a single reintroduction now stands as one of the longest records we have of a large herbivore being returned to northern Canada. The trend is not ambiguous, and there is a thread running through all of it that belongs in a different category than biology. The word and the animal. The Dene community at Nahanni Butte has a word in their language for the wood bison. For more than 100 years, the speakers of that language carried that word with no animal for it to point to. The rivers and meadows of the valley held the name of a creature that no living person there had ever seen on the land. The word outlasted the animal. It was passed from generation to generation, not as a memory of something lost, but as a placeholder, a grammatical space kept open in case it was ever needed again. Languages don't usually work that way. Words without reference tend to disappear. The fact that this one didn't is its own kind of testimony to what the animal meant. And now the animal has come back to meet the word, not as a managed population behind a fence, not as a symbol in a conservation brochure, on the same sandbars along the Liard River, where the den had always known them to be. The annual surveys that count the herd are conducted in July, by boat, when the bison come down to the river bars. The community at Nahanni Butte has lived alongside that survey for decades now, watching the number grow, watching the animals move through ground that carries their name in a language that refused to forget them. That, to me, is the most precise way to measure what was lost. Not in population counts, not in habitat acres. In the gap between a name and the thing it describes, a gap that opened when the last herd was gone and sat empty for over a century, held open only by a language that knew something that biologists didn't, that the animal might come back if someone was patient enough to wait. The lesson from the north. Here is what 45 years of data from Nahanni actually says, stripped of sentiment. 28 animals, a subspecies declared extinct, rediscovered by one man on one flight path in 1957, transferred to a genetic ark in 1965, airlifted into the boreal in 1980, supplemented twice more in 1989 and 1998, and now running across 10,000 square kilometers in 3 jurisdictions without anyone needing to open another crate. The recovery program that built this outcome spent years calculating exactly how many animals it could afford to release without endangering the ark, exactly which site offered the right combination of meadow, mineral, and river flat, exactly how wide the genetic base needed to be before the herd could be trusted to carry itself. All of that precision mattered. None of that precision is what makes the story remarkable. What makes it remarkable is everything that happened after the crates were opened. The bison crossed the river we said they wouldn't cross. They settled the ground we didn't choose for them. They restarted processes we couldn't have engineered if we'd tried. The wallows, the nitrogen cycles, the gradual reopening of meadow corridors that had been closing since before the First World War. The engineering didn't come from the program. It came from the animal, from thousands of years of evolutionary relationship with exactly this kind of land, preserved intact in a subspecies that simply needed to be put back in the place it knew. We tend to think of restoration as something we do to a landscape. We plan it, we fund it, we manage it toward the outcome we designed. The instinct is reasonable. The damage was human-caused, so the repair feels like it should be human-managed, from start to finish. Every step controlled, every outcome predicted. Nahanni says something different. What the program got right was the genetics, the site selection, the disease-free status of the founders, the patient management of the Elk Island Ark over 15 years before a single animal was released. Those things were essential. Without them, there's no story to tell. But the recovery itself, the expansion, the river crossings, the ecological processes switching back on, the slow return of the meadow systems, none of that was in the plan. The plan ended when the crates were opened. Everything after that belonged to the bison. We didn't restore the valley. We returned the animal that knew how. And then we got out of the way. What happened next wasn't ours. And maybe that's the whole point. The land had been waiting, not for a program, not for a strategy, not for a management framework, but for the one thing that could actually do the work. The animal it was built around. If this story changed how you think about what recovery actually means, share it with someone who'd sit with it, and subscribe, because there are more of these stories than you'd ever guess. I've got plenty more to tell.